So, with a small delay, welcome all to this halftime seminar. It's a little bit late. It should have been in the spring, I guess, but well, it doesn't. It just makes it even better, I think. And so Virginia, she's my PhD student, and she will be. We had quite a good event yesterday, so we'll continue today with Virginia giving a more full description of her work, and after that we have the opponent Päivi Kinnunen from Helsinki. She will be commenting on Virginia's work, and then they will discuss future avenues and ideas and what she's been doing, and follow with questions from anyone who wants to join in. And I hope you will all be active and have a quite nice morning now. So please, Virginia, present your work.
Thank you, Mats. Let me share my screen. And I'm just gonna put the Zoom window with all your faces up there so I can see you. I prepared the slides so that you can have it in full screen up there, and hopefully it doesn't, you have a corner free on the upper right side hand. So yes, welcome to this seminar, which, as Mats mentioned, is a continuation of the event on role model we had yesterday. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Virginia.grande. You're welcome to use Virginia, and my pronouns are she, they, so you're also welcome to use any of these to refer to me. And like we mentioned, we had this event yesterday on the role modeling computing, and it was so very nice to be part of this discussion. So if you didn't catch the event yesterday, you can contact me to get access to the recordings. But anytime I have a presentation about role modeling, people ask me, but do the participants in your study think about whether they have role models or not? And so I'm just going to ask you this question. If you think about a professional context, who is a role model for you? And why is this person a role model for you? And I'm going to take this chance while you're thinking to send you a few files in the chat. So all right, so hopefully you can see 4 files in the chat now. If anyone can nod it, that's a yes, thank you. And so this way you have access to the slides, because the slides include some links and so you have the possibility to check those at your own pace. And it also includes the preprint version of 2 of the papers I'm going to be talking about today. Unfortunately, I didn't have the preprint version of the first paper. I only found this, final version, but it wasn't the last one. So if you're interested, you can always ask me after the seminar and I'll find it. But yes, please remember your answer to this question, and I'll get back to it later on in the seminar. But I myself, of course, have thought about role modeling quite a lot. So I have a very long list of role models. But I thought I would bring up some of the ones that I was thinking about when thinking about the expectations and goals for this seminar. So there's a project by these researchers you see here. The project is called The Geek as a Gatekeeper, and it has quite some connections with role modeling. So you can follow the blog there to learn more about it. The reason I'm bringing it up now is because recently I had the chance to attend 2 seminars, one by Eva and one by Maria. And it was very important for me as a PhD student to see senior researchers who don't have this attitude of, here I am standing and now I'm going to lecture you and you just absorb this, but rather they created this environment where you can see academic presentations as a chance for the person presenting to learn with and from the audience. And I think that's something we're trying to have here today, or I would like to try to aim to. have today. Another presentation I attended recently was the PhD defense of Carolina de Barros Vidal. Part of what Carolina was talking about was in physics education research, how does this dehumanization, how we become, or we're expected to be these productivity machines. And then we also have our very human needs of, eating and resting and whatnot, but we can have this culture of, not being allowed to do that and just focus on work and producing. So that's something I had in mind today, and I'll explain in a second why. So expectations and goals for today. I'm aware that you come from different disciplines and institutions, traditions, and whatnot. So I tried to adapt the language and approach a little bit based on this. And I think, as I was saying with these examples before, that this seminar is not about me convincing you that I'm brilliant, but rather about me showing vulnerability and showing you, this thing that I'm growing here that could go in many directions that I need to tend to. And what do you think about about all these things? How can I move forward? I got a message this morning from a friend saying that this seminar was like Christmas, in the sense that I'm gonna get things that I need, things that I want, but basically everything comes from very good intentions. And I thought, yes, this is the mindset I want to have for this event. And we might have a few, let's say, unscheduled breaks. And here comes the talking a bit about being a human in the education research or subject education research. I've had anxiety for, I think it's over a decade now. And so I've been told by people not in my work environment that this is something you need to hide. You can't, in a professional setting, show that you have anxiety. You will kill your career. I think it's some of the statements that I got. And so my anxiety is not going away. And the more I postponed this seminar, actually, the worse it got. So now I'm sort of inviting you today to create this space where it is okay to be a researcher having anxiety. And one way to do that is that if I have a panic attack during this seminar, then I'll just tell you that I need a 5-minute break, or if I can't, I'll just turn off my camera. And then panic attacks are not dangerous, so I just need a few minutes to let my body calm down. And in the meantime, you can have a coffee or stretch or do whatever you like to do during a break. So thank you for being part of that. And let's see what is the outline for today. So I talked yesterday a little bit about why it is important to study role modeling. So today I'm going to talk a bit more about my own personal motivation, you could say, of why I'm doing this. And then I know in some of your disciplines, you count mostly journal publications as, let's say, publications, but in computing education, conference papers are also valued in that sense. So from the papers I've written, I've selected 4. The first one is a short conference paper, then there's 2 full conference papers, and then there's a manuscript for a journal paper. So I will be presenting the relation between all these papers, and then ideas for what I could write, for the time that I have left in my PhD. And then, as Matt said, after a break, I will discuss with Päivi, and yeah, it was very nice and interesting to discuss yesterday, so it's I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you, Päivi, for agreeing to be here. And yes, again, like Matt said, then we get input from you, and I also look forward to that. You're welcome to have questions during the seminar, but also to contact me afterwards. The idea of this seminar, I think in Swedish you say, is to have this red thread, as in some kind of line that you can see this connection of how everything works together. But while I was planning it, I felt this red thread was more like this detective board where you have like many different points and you just have to see this connection. So I hope I managed to create something like that. So starting with who am I and why do this work? I've had in an academic setting very different roles with different levels of power. So I've been a student in Spain, and then I finished in Sweden. After that, I became a teaching assistant, and I was a full-time teacher in a private university in the US for a semester before I started my PhD here. And throughout all this time, I was a volunteer for one professional organization in computing, the ACM, and in particular for the branch they have on women in computing. So giving 2 examples from these settings, when I was doing this voluntary work, we organized a lot of events, and I saw that I have the power to see who gets the mic, who do we invite as a keynote speaker or as a panelist or whatnot. This person gets somehow endorsed by us and presented as a role model. And how are we selecting these people? And also, as someone who's in the audience, sometimes I would see these people as role models, and sometimes I wouldn't. And I wasn't sure why, like, how does role modeling work? So I looked into how we can do this based on research, and I couldn't find so much. And also, being a teacher, I got this since when I was a full-time teacher. I was in my late 20s, more or less, I think. I got these students coming to me and saying, it's so important to see someone like us. You're so similar to us, but being a teacher, this is amazing. And those of you who know me know that my first reaction is imposter syndrome. Oh no. But it made me think that we're all in contexts where we can be perceived as role models, whether we want that or not. And we also have the power to make some people be potential role models. So those are the kind of questions I had in mind, and I wanted to use research to address this. So if we think about the aims of my work, as I showed you this detective board before, I want to sort of draw a map of role modeling. I don't want to focus on a very narrow aspect of it, but rather I want to touch upon many different things and see how they connect. So I'm developing a framework that helps us understand role modeling, and it's to have some theory-based reflections on the questions that you saw in the title, on who, what, how, why, and so on. The idea when you use this is that it helps you understand the context that you belong to and maybe even enact change on them. I would be very happy if that was one of the uses we have for it. And so hopefully it helps us create a base to broaden participation in computing, and broadening participation understood as this maybe more traditional way of seeing increased access and participation for people from marginalized genders, ethnicities, and so on, but also to have this sense of belonging for people who represent a more diverse set of interest in computing that I will present later as part of the papers that are included today. So I don't know if you're familiar with positionality statements. I basically describe a little bit who I am, and then I can think about how the people in my, the participants in my research perceive me as, and how those two columns here may affect my research. So I will show you the end of, or this table completely full at the end of the presentation, but I wanted to bring this up so that you can have it in the back of your mind while I talk about my data, and maybe you can guess a little bit, yeah, how these things affected my research. All right, so where did this all start? So I wanted to know how teachers in computing experience being role models for their students. And to do that, I interviewed 9 teachers at my department at Uppsala University. And I tried to look for people who had different levels of teacher experience, that worked in different areas of computing, came from different countries, had different ages, genders, and so on. And we used a phenomenographic approach. If you're not familiar with this, we had this question that I showed before on teachers' experiences on being a role model for their students. And when you use phenomenography, you choose an object of study or a phenomenon, in this case, being a role model, and see how your participants understand it in different ways. When you have these different ways, you have them in categories that are related to each other, and you produce what's called an outcome space, where you show these categories as different levels of understanding, usually with a hierarchical structure that you'll see in a second. So if we think about level of understanding being represented to the left as the lowest level of understanding, or the less complex level of understanding, and to the right as the more complex level of understanding, we took 5 interviews as a pilot study, and we wrote the short paper you see below, and we came up with 6 categories. So starting from the left, teachers were talking about being a role model as being someone who knows the content, then someone who transmits interest, and we could see that as focusing on the subject, then showing something about themselves, whether that was positive or maybe negative or something that was outside of their control. So they were talking about how they were perceived. And then some of them talked about the students being a heterogeneous group, and so perceiving teachers in different ways. And also the role modeling not being limited to the classroom environment, but also affecting the society and profession outside of it. So you can see that they're talking about the what, the how, and the who. And when we wrote this paper, I was pregnant. So when it was time to present it, it was Mats who did it, as you can see. Mats here, and again, making this image of a researcher more human, he added pictures of my kid back then. And this was shared on Facebook, and I hope as a joke, a student commented, let's see, are you saying there is a baby who already has more publications than I do? So I can see as a bit of a joke that, yeah, was this baby a bad role model, right? Like we're giving an example of, look at this success, but it doesn't seem like something I could achieve. In the interviews we saw that, and in the literature, that when we say bad role model, it can be, in this case, someone who cannot be copied, but it can also be someone we consider a bad influence for the person imitating them. It can be someone who tries to be a role model, but fails to be copied, or it can be someone who represents something we shouldn't become. So just using the same word to represent 4 different concepts, it becomes a bit ambiguous. So how can we talk about role modeling? And here comes the idea of developing a framework that helps us reflect on this. So when I ask you about who's a role model for you and why, maybe you were thinking about what can be modeled. So I'm going to show you how I see this, and I would like you to think about where does your example of a role model fit here, or maybe it doesn't, and that would be very interesting to hear. So a role model can represent an achievement, which is something externally given to the role model, like for example, an award, or it can represent something inherent to the role model, an aspect of this person, for example, being fair. If we think about achievements, then they can be objective or subjective. So for example, if I'm a full professor, that's objective, it's a fact, no discussion about it. But if someone considers me as successful, then may interpret that as being someone who has money, being someone who has a high age index. So we all have different definitions of what we consider as success. And if we think about aspects of the role model, then we can talk about a competency, character trait, attitude or behavior. And those 2 last boxes are for some people relatively similar. So the point is that you have a box to put the kind of role modeling in. There doesn't need to be a very a specific line there. Examples of that are being a good public speaker, being an outgoing person, or having this motivating, happy attitude that some of us like to have in our groups or in our teams. Right, so hopefully you could find your role modeling example there. Otherwise, please let me know. And we talked about this, the what, the achievement and aspects as part of the framework presented in paper 2. But I also saw material on who in terms of role modeling. And so if we see the person who's being observed and imitating as the role model, and the person who's doing the mimicking, if you will, calling that the emulator, then we can talk about different examples when the role model is in computing or is not in computing, and the same for the emulator. So you can see in the paper examples of these combinations. We can also talk about who is not necessarily a role model, because we tend to use interchangeably terms like mentor or hero. So in the paper, I talk a little bit about the differences that I've seen in the literature when defining these terms. And we can talk about how, as we saw a little bit in paper 1, that teachers can be, or role models can be aware of representing certain things, and can also have the intention or not of these things being emulated. So if we combine this, I can give you examples from the interviews with the teachers. One can be aware of being a fair person and having the intention of the students also becoming fair. One can be very aware of making jokes in class, but not having the intention of students to also make jokes all the time, even though it's fine if they do. If we're not aware of representing something, then we can't have the intention of someone emulating this. But I think we're all too aware of not being aware of something and that being copied anyway, especially if you're a parent, you're very aware of what I'm talking about. And this doesn't have to be just negative aspects of ourselves, just positive as well. Which we talked a little bit about with the example of a bad role model being perceived as good or bad in different ways and having different terms for this. All right, so this is what you can see in paper 2 in terms of the framework. We'll be talking about role modeling, but we haven't really defined role model. So this might sound familiar for those of you who were here yesterday. A role model is someone who represents a concrete example of how to achieve a goal. And traditionally, we talk about achieving that goal by imitating what this person represents, and that's called a positive role model. But we can also have them as an example of what not to do or be, and so we try to avoid becoming them, and that's a negative role model. As we just saw, they can represent achievement or aspects. And then coming back to the baby example, their success needs to seem attainable. So we have to be able to think that with time and or effort, we can become what this person represents. And so in paper 1, I talked about role models being a concrete representation of something abstract, and I talked about that as being an embodiment of something. So if we put all of these things together, then a role model is a person who is a concrete representation who embodies a seemingly attainable something, that being an achievement or an aspect. And we're gonna either imitate or avoid this achievement or aspect so that it can help us achieve a goal. Okay, so if we go back to the framework, this is what we had in paper 2, and now I'm gonna try to explain how the rest of what I've done affects this. So if we consider other questions, then it's very difficult to separate them from the ones we've seen here, the what, the who, and the how. So we've written about the where, and not just in a physical sense, but talking about the social context and cultures and norms, where the role modeling happens and how it affects this phenomenon. So this is work done with Anne-Catherine Peters, Mats Daniels, and Matti Tedre. And we basically, the main message is, as you see in the title, that social context, cultures, and norms affect role modeling. We use concepts like disciplinary and professional identities, and we talked about identity as something that is not possessed by an individual, but rather that something that we negotiate and it's constructed in social interaction. In the paper, you can see different examples of people being emulators and role models. So we have like a historical perspective on computing, where people being these high profiles will have an influence on how the discipline is shaped. We talked about whether a teacher becomes a role model or not, depending on what kind of disciplinary identities they represent, and other examples between student and student as well. We end the paper with a call for action, where we invite people in different positions with different levels of power to give more visibility to certain role models. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of this, what you can do to think about role modeling using the framework. And those 2 examples are in academia. I'm going to start with the example of being a teacher. I'm not going to explain the table, but you'll see in a moment how it works. So if I have a role, what do I model in this role, and what could I model? That would be one of the applications of the framework. And I've given a presentation about this, so you can see this example step by step in that video. But let's say I'm a teacher, and then I can think about what achievements or aspects do I model for my students. And you will end up with something like you see in the table here. And you see that there are gaps, and maybe I can consider if there are other achievements or aspects of myself that I could include here. So that would be step 2. What achievements or aspects have I not considered before that I could model for my students? So you can use this framework as a way of thinking about your own role modeling. These are the resources that I have. How can I better use them? One could say. But we can also take a different approach. And I'm going to give the example of conference organizing. We wrote a short paper about it that you see below that it's not included in this seminar. And this was also touched upon yesterday in Dr. Ella Taylor-Smith's presentation about the 5 aspects framework. So I'm just leaving a hint here. Since it's ongoing work, you can follow Ella to get updates when something is published. But let's say that this is an example of when I can think of role modeling, not in terms of the resources I have, but ideally, what would I like to have in this specific context? So I also have examples of this that you can look in more detail, but consider that you're a conference organizer, and then you think about what achievement or aspects do you want to give visibility to through the people that you invite to your event, as I was mentioning at the beginning of this seminar. And then you come up with a table like this. Then you talk to the other organizers who also have their own table, and you try to see whether you agree on certain things, what's important for you as a group, and so on. And then you could ask your pool of candidates for speakers to see what they think they offer as role models, and then you try to see if there's an overlap with what they offer and what you're expecting, so to speak. And you can continue doing this with other aspects of conference organization, but I just wanted to bring this up because we did this in one conference that I was part of. And I thought it was interesting that for some people, it was very important that the people presenting had multidisciplinary experience. I hadn't even thought about that. So it really helped us be more explicit about what we expect in role modeling in this particular context. All right, so we talked about where and how to use the framework, but we also talked about when we think about what we're modeling, for example, which criteria do we use to think what's important? And Päivi gave a presentation yesterday when she was talking about being a good teacher in terms of competencies. I guess this is more being a good teacher from an ethical perspective that we worked at. So as a teacher, why do I choose what I model? And this is a paper we've written. We need to submit it somewhere. So right now it's a manuscript. It's work with Thomas Lennefors, Anne-Catherine Peters, and Christina von Hauswolf. And this was very interesting to write. And we focus on a teacher in computing being seen as a role model, then how, if people are going to emulate their behavior, how should one behave? So we use 3 different theories from ethical theories. We have virtue ethics, where it's about representing desirable character traits like or virtues like perseverance and humility. We talk about care ethics, where the focus is more on relationships, caring for others or for other people or other things, and addressing their needs. And we talked about ethics of freedom, that it's more about being your unique self, and sort of challenges the more traditional view of role modeling. And part of the outcomes of this work is that we saw that there are, for example, care may not be exactly represented in the framework, so we could go back to it and revise how to include it there, maybe as part of the aspects, for example. Right, so this is what I've done so far, and now we move on to what I'm working on right now and what comes next. So I got a notification a few days ago from Facebook saying that it was 4 years ago that this paper was presented and written. So was looking back and rereading this paper for this seminar. And I thought that if I had written this paper now, it would look different, which was a good thing. And I think it's because I had this wider set of influences. For example, I read about care ethics in higher education, and I read Katerina Günther's work on students and teachers' identity work in higher education biology, where it talks about, from the perspective of teachers, how care is gendered. So when I thought about the categories I presented at the beginning of this seminar, and if you remember, the higher level of understanding was the part that involved caring about others or seeing the needs of others within and outside the classroom. Now, having this view, I think there's some of us that are socializing to care and so would see this as a much basic level of understanding. So having a wider set of influence really affects how I see my work, and I think it has helped me grow as a researcher, I would say. And I call this slide looking back and looking around, because what I had around me became much wider while I was doing my PhD. So I started with computing, and then computing education and different communities within that. But I also learned from people and this starts getting wider, engineering, then STEM, and then even subject education through the research school that we had. And I think it can be a bit dizzying even to see all these different ways of doing research, all the different literature that each community considers important. So it can be a bit challenging, but overall it's a very enriching experience. And it makes me think of my role as a researcher, as a person who tries to connect these different communities in some way. So having that in mind, what do I plan to do for the time that I have left in my PhD, which is a year and a half approximately? Mainly to refine the framework. And I want to use more theory for that, particularly identity theory. And I want to do some more empirical work. So I have the teacher interviews that I mentioned at the beginning, the ones that I haven't used yet. And then I want to think of other populations besides teachers that are involved in role modeling computing. I will use thematic coding analysis and then my own framework to analyze this. And as we saw yesterday, there are many questions that are related to role modeling. So I would like to think about which ones I want to address. But this becomes a huge task. So let's see who's working on interesting questions that are related to this and wants to work together. So considering this, someone that is very good to work with is Marisa, who's finishing her PhD, and part of that is TA's perspectives of the role and work tasks. So she collected this data, she interviewed TAs, and she also had this training course for them where they have to write a reflection on an interesting situation or interactions that they had experienced or anticipate to experience as a teaching assistant. And then they would reflect on how they handled that situation or would theoretically do so. So then we take this data that is not collected thinking of role modeling, but you can use a role modeling perspective to look at it. And we're seeing that the TAs talk about, now that I'm a TA, I can see what other TAs are doing, and so follow their example, or the same with the course leader, but they can also think about when they were students and had TAs and sort of think whether they want to follow the same examples or do the opposite if we're thinking about negative role models. Then we have students as role models. So I asked the students in a course I was teaching recently if they could write a reflection on what they thought there was about them that others in the course may want to emulate. And this was a short reflection. They could write from 10 lines to 1 page. 60 of them submitted their reflection and 45 agreed to be part of this study. And they mentioned a lot of things. They talk a lot about being perseverant and hardworking, contributing to their group. But they also mentioned concrete achievements like having industry experience, and then some beliefs as advocating for certain open software or libre software and so on. So here are some examples of the work I'm doing right now. Then, like I said, it would be fantastic to work with more people. So if you're familiar with ITICSE working groups, I would like to propose one on teachers as role models. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a team of 5 to 10 researchers coming from different places who work quite intensively before the conference online, and then the first days of the conference in person. We produce some report that is presented at the end of the conference, and then is finalized and revised and hopefully published. So you can see the details of this at the 6E website. And since teachers as role models is quite a broad topic, within that, it would be interesting for me to think about how to incorporate this to teacher training. We saw yesterday emotions and role modeling. Personally, I think related to emotions and somehow competencies is mental health and role modeling. We mentioned competencies yesterday and talking about role modeling for particular groups, like Max Skolodinsky was talking about trans people and gender diverse people as well. And of course, there could be many more things, so it will be very interesting to hear about what other people interested in this topic would like to study. So if you're interested in this, please contact me. And so finally, I would like to update the framework that you saw as part of paper 2. Ideally, it will be a journal article, but if I'm being realistic, I think by the time I defend It's probably be a manuscript in the best case. More likely would just be my kappa. And I would like to include identity theory, as I said, and in particular, seeing identity as performance, recognition, and competence. I will finish the analyzing the interviews with teachers that I mentioned before, and I will try to incorporate the conclusions that we've seen from the previous papers, like I mentioned, care not being represented in the framework. Now, I mentioned that I'm drawing this map of role modeling, and I think by the time I update the framework, there will have been significant contributions from other people. So I want to find a name of the framework, because right now people say your framework, and I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. And also maybe you have some thoughts on which term to use for it, because I used model before, now I use framework. Some people have told me conceptualization. So what do you think about this? It's something I would be very interested in hearing. Great. So just as a summary, this is how the framework looked in black. Then we saw the papers I've written, and now I'm adding in blue how the papers that I have in mind would affect the framework. So to the what, it will be adding care, also emotions, and all the examples you see there. If we think about who, then we'll have teachers, TA, students, and then maybe people from other communities. And if we think about how, I talked about perception, maybe being perceived as something that you're not, and the science identity theory. We talked about using particular context of teacher training. And maybe you realize this when I talked about students, TAs, that there's a when component as well. So if I'm a student being a role model for a student, that's immediate role modeling, but it could be I'm a TA for a student, for an example that will become important the year after, or a teacher for a student, which will be for the farther future. So that's something I would like to write about as well. All right, so just wanted to say thank you for being here and listening, and for all the growth, both professional and personal, that I had during this. If I had the chance to write an acknowledgement section, it would have been very long, so I just get one slide to do this. And like I said, very interesting to have this opportunity to connect with different ways of thinking and doing research. I really think it's a privilege to be a PhD student, and to get this input from you on how to make this grow. I hope that I convince you a little bit also doing some kind of change in your context. And for that, I'm going to leave you with a few questions so that you can maybe think about them during the break after the seminar. So those are whether you're interested in trying the framework in your own context, if you want to be part of the ITICSI working group that I mentioned, maybe you can think of other applications of the framework, or you have ideas on how to reach people that can implement the change if you're not one of them. And at an individual level, maybe you can think of a concrete step that you can take next week to be more aware of your role modeling. Or you have any other input, I would be very happy to hear from you. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. Quite nice. And I just put in the chat, I just want to stress that the ITICSI working group, that's one of the most influential avenues you have to present in our community. It's you bring people together that you work with, and then these papers typically has by far the highest citations. So consider this. This should be a good thing to be part of. So Virginia, do you think we should have a break before we let Päivi come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say that I showed this positionality statement table, and then somehow it was skipped in the presentation, I realize now, but you have the slides, so you get the extra material that it's not in the recording if you want to look at it. But yeah, maybe we could have a 15-minute break, something like that.
So 10 past?
I think so.
Okay, thank you again. Quite nice.
Thank you.